And welcome to another edition of our Barnes Dennig SOC readiness assessment, DIY, do-it-yourself, preparing for SOC reports for those of doing one for their first time. I'm with Bryan Gayhart, a director on our SOC team, and today we're talking about subservice organizations. How you doing today, Bryan?
Very good. How about yourself, Robert?
Good. Thanks for doing this with me. I was going to start this off with a question just to lay the foundation. What is a subservice organization?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great place to start. They're very critical here in the SOC report because if you think about your control environment, you've got a whole bunch of vendors that you use. We're all familiar with the vendor phrase, right? But then for SOC reports, there's kind of this special vendor, which they call a subservice organization. And essentially all that is, part of my control environment is relying upon another third party in order to meet the trust services criteria. So whatever I'm trying to, report on. And it might be easiest to look at an example, right? So if I use a third-party data center, I'm relying on that third party, that data center, to provide physical security controls, right, around that data center. And so I have a couple options then, right? I can include that in my report in the inclusive method, but that's pretty rare. I mean, do you ever see the inclusive method?
We do see it typically when there are related parties. There are companies that already own pieces of subsidiaries, and they say, oh, go ahead and test them and include them, as you say, the inclusive method. But by far, 95% of the time, it's that carve-out method.
Yeah, so when you think about the carve-out method, then, I've taken that, we'll stick with the data center example, and, I've identified them in my report that, hey, our data is hosted at this data center, and my control environment extends to that data center to the extent that they're providing the physical security around where my data, is essentially housed, if you think about that data center. So that's where subservice organizations come in the SOC report space.
That's a good way to explain it. Why do readers care? Why do SOC reports own such a special thing called a subservice org?
Yeah, it gets back again to kind of, I'm relying upon this service organization for some sort of service, right? But I want to know, who are they using? What are their vendors? What are their key, in this process? And so that's where that subservice organization comes in. I want to know what third parties they're using. Could be the data center, maybe a third party managed service providers part of the control environment. So I want to have a complete picture of the controls at the service organization. So I need to know what those key controls are that they are then outsourcing to these subservice organizations.
That's a good way to put it. When I say that it's kind of a SOC report is half IT audit, half disclosure document, this is that disclosure part where a reader gets to learn about the information and what they're buying when they buy services from this company. Oh, they buy services from a handful of others as well.
Yeah, exactly. And, if you think about the SOC report process, for us, this is one of the first areas we touch on, right? You got to learn about the service organization and the service they're providing. But then it's kind of what vendors and ultimately these subservice organizations come into play to help us fully understand that service that they're offering.
That's great. Do you mind expanding on that? So since this is kind of a DIY concept, would you mind describing the process we go through when we're trying to determine which of these vendors is one of these special vendors, a subservice org?
Yeah, so for us, we have this kind of nice spreadsheet that we use. We go through, we identify the key vendors, and we walk through a few steps. So we'll look at, do they touch client data? Are they critical to the service offering? If they had a breach, would you have to call your customers? Would you be needing to explain to them that, hey, we outsource a piece, they had an issue, it impacts you, here's what's happening. And we kind of walk through a few steps on how that works and then ultimately make a decision. And half the battle is figuring out all the vendors that are in play and then determining if they're a subservice organization. So if you think about the IT space and you think about all the different vendors you may use, that's a starting point. Occasionally you can go to accounting and say, hey, can we get a vendor report of all the people that we pay on a regular basis? And it might trigger your memory to kind of get a couple others.
That's right. That happens almost every time. We think of more as we go through the process. Tell me, then once they're identified, what kinds of evidence should someone expect an auditor to show up? Say we show up and say, okay, there are these 7 subservice orgs. What are we going to ask to see to verify that they've determined as such?
Yeah, that's a great question. We carve them out in the report and then we almost point the finger and say, hey, they're responsible for these controls, that they need to have them in place. But at that point, our job's not done as the service organization, right? We need to then have controls that say, hey, we monitor that subservice organization to make sure that they're living up to their end of the service level agreement, their contract, or whatever services we're getting from them. A common way is to get their SOC report, read it, review it, go back to the data center example. Make sure that the testing around the physical security or whatever else that that's important to us at that data center, that they're achieving those controls. There's no exceptions, no issues with their SOC report. If they don't have a SOC report, maybe you have a questionnaire that you send out, or even maybe you go visit, maybe you do a field visit. Not as common anymore, but it's another option.
Yeah. Hey, are there tools that clients can use, that companies can use to monitor their vendors? What do people do to keep track of all that?
Yeah, definitely. There's a number of tools out there that we see. A popular one is Vendminder. That's one where they'll actually do some work in terms of getting the SOC reports and providing you some information. But it brings together basically a place where you can gather all your documents. You can kind of do that risk assessment on your vendors. You can track sign-offs, things of the sort. OnSpring's another popular one we see. That's more of just a place where you do all the work yourselves, but it tracks that, allows for approvals, sign-offs, and notifications of when you need to revisit that vendor.
Yep. No, those are great. Thanks very much, Bryan. Here's my curveball question. One more for you. Can the list of subservice organizations change whether someone's doing a report on security or security and availability and confidentiality?
Yeah, I think it could change. It gets back to what services are being provided. Backups are a lot more critical in terms of availability. And so that may be then a subservice if you're relying on a third party to do your backups, like a managed service provider. So they may be more critical if you're doing availability than if you're just doing security.
Yeah, in my experience, that gets proven out when they're matching a precise control that goes to that vendor to make them a subservice org. Sometimes those controls are part of the criteria for availability or confidentiality, but not security. And in those cases, they end up being added on as subservice orgs just for certain criteria for that SOC report.
Yeah, and I think you'll find that, when you do, because you do have to have complementary subservice organization controls in the report, right? So that would say, hey, this subservice is responsible for this control and it meets this criteria. So as you start identifying those, you could then identify different vendors that support availability and confidentiality.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that does help when we talk with companies that have started this themselves. If they're really in that gray area, I'm not sure if this is a special vendor subservice org or just a regular vendor. If the proof ends up being if they can write that subservice organization control, like, all right, what control are we relying on them for? And if they can nail it, then it's clearly a subservice org. And if it ends up being maybe not, then maybe it's a regular vendor.
Well, thanks for the curveball question. Not sure if I hit a home run, but maybe I got a single or a double out of it.
You nailed it. Thanks for your time. I think we covered it. I don't know, is there anything else we should cover?
I think we're good.
All right. Thanks for your time today. That concludes our video on subservice organizations. If you have any questions for us, call, click, or subscribe anytime.